Great, thank you. And look, we know we're between you and your morning tea, so we'll keep this brief and concrete. We've heard a lot so far this morning about the why and the what of mandatory climate disclosures, and what we're hoping to bring to the discussion in this little 10-minute chat is the how. How do we actually make this happen? We heard Kate O'Rourke from ASIC mention the challenge for small and medium businesses that are caught up in the supply chains of larger businesses and therefore have to start reporting on their emissions. And Fiona Reynolds, chairing that panel, asked the great question, well, who should you be turning to for advice and support to deliver those outcomes? And we think, both of us, that the answer to that question should be your accountant. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that all fits together. Could we have the next slide, please, Jess? So Xero, I hope everyone knows, is an accounting software company. Why do we care about this? Because as part of our overall sustainability strategy, the third pillar of that strategy is that we will work to help our customers and partners become more sustainable. The impact that we can have globally with over 4 million customers is far greater than the impact that we can have ourselves. So part of my role is helping accountants and bookkeepers to upskill in carbon accounting so that they can deliver those services to small and medium businesses. We have a global partnership with Sumday, which is a carbon accounting platform that helps accountants and bookkeepers deliver that service. I guess the first question I have for Jess is, despite the fact that we have created this ecosystem where we're putting the tools in people's hands, is it actually reasonable to ask small and medium businesses for audit quality greenhouse gas emissions accounting data, and how are companies responding to that? How are they going about it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the question everyone asks, and a lot of the time you hear standards coming in, SMBs are getting caught in the supply chains. Oh, is this reasonable, or is this just ridiculous? If we don't have our own house in order, how dare we go and ask a supply chain of 500,000 suppliers who might be SMBs for that same information? So as Tam said, we're going to try and talk really practical here about what we've seen work. So we like to take a really education-first approach. And that means that, yes, of course it's reasonable to ask your suppliers for audit-ready emissions data, particularly if you have a Scope 3 target, or if you're genuinely looking to get to net zero. It doesn't really matter what type of carbon accounting you're doing if the entire supply chain's emissions, which usually account for 90%, are coming from industry averages. And the largest companies in the world at the moment are obviously doing their carbon accounting, but you look at the little numbers in the back of the report, and we all do that on industry averages because it's the best we've got. So we're taking spend and we're multiplying it by, say, a US EPA emissions factor, and here are our Scope 3 emissions. But the problem is, and it's becoming a governance issue, is that if we're telling the market that we have Scope 3 targets or are very dedicated to reaching net zero, but we have never actually asked the majority of our supply chain, do you have primary emissions factors for the goods or services that I buy from you? And what would be required for you to be able to provide that? Then I seriously question how we can continue to say these are legitimate targets. We have to ask that question. And so how are people doing it? In our experience, what we're seeing, and this is with public companies through to actually small B&Bs in Hobart, they're both doing the same thing. They're doing a spend-based estimate, but then what they're doing is saying, well, these are our suppliers, and we're getting that from the GL sitting in Xero, for example, and we're going to ask them these questions, which are generally templated and are the questions you need to ask if you want to replace averages with actuals. They're not, what's your best estimate for Scope 1 and 2? That's good, and it's a good place to start, but if your board's legitimately hoping that you're going to be able to credibly track progress towards net zero across Scope 3, that's not helpful, because the actual question that needs to be answered is, do I have a credible emissions factor that can replace that average that we have been using for the last 5 years? And so you have to ask the questions that allow that professional judgment call to be made. So they ask those questions. Now, they may not be able to answer, and so what you're providing is access to education first. So upskilling, and not upskilling of what is ESG that they could get on YouTube, That should be upskilling in the type that you can pick up a file and know what the jobs to be done are to get this type of accounting done. So provide that type of education. Then it's accounting support. They're going to have questions, and you might be able to see some of the tickets that often come through. Oh, I've been asked to do this for my customer, but I've never done it before. Like, where should I start? Or, oh, I'm in a shared office. How would I possibly go about this? Those kind of questions, you can provide that support so that they have someone that can answer it. And then obviously the software I leave to last, because it is last. Some of this can be done in a good spreadsheet. We're the first to say that. But some of this can be made far more intuitive and part of the normal accounting process. If they've got accounting software, same way they have Xero to do taxes and payroll, this is the new normal of accounting. So they pass that on. And that means that those suppliers are actually, yes, getting a question that they probably can't answer, but they're getting the support to actually start embedding it.
Yeah, look, I think that's really important, because Xero's a great advocate of small and medium businesses, and what we don't want to see is people stopping doing business with small and medium businesses because they either can't supply this information or because the only way to reduce their emissions is to reduce spend. I mean, both of those are a bad outcome for small and medium businesses.
Yeah.
Are they actually responding at the moment when you ask them these questions, or is it just, I'm too busy trying to keep the lights on?
Yeah, 100%. Even with really large organisations, we often see one of the first things, and it comes from, I think, a place of empathy for SMBs, but there is just so much hesitancy to even ask, because the initial thing is, oh, they won't have this. Of course they won't have this. They're not going to be able to provide it. So why would we add to their load? So I think it does come from that genuine place of, even though we have these targets, even though we have mandatory reporting, most people like yourself don't want to sit there and crack a whip and say, we're not going to buy from you next year if you can't provide it. So they just don't ask. And that is a really big problem, because are SMBs responding is a very good question. We have the companies that go and ask the questions, they track all of the information. We have some public companies, and they're very big customers from a lot of these SMBs with an 85% response rate. We have some with a 5% response rate. The problem is we get tied up in, oh, they won't respond, or what will the response rate be, but why bother? Instead of thinking about how valuable that data is. Who cares if everyone doesn't respond in the first instance? That's very valuable. If you're sitting there as a sustainability leader trying to get the board or trying to get anyone to consider this stuff properly, understand where our suppliers are next to our targets, introduce the governance risk conversation, manage are we actually across this, then obviously having that data to say, hey, we asked the right questions, we provided access to education, tools, support, resources, and 2% of the supply chain responded. That is a very compelling bit of information and data to raise at the next board meeting to say, we either need to invest in this space or we really need to look at what we're doing with our emission reduction. So to me, the question is not, oh, what response rate would we get? Because we see it varies dramatically. But it's how useful is that information to actually add some concrete stats to what we need to do next. The other thing that's really interesting is, of course, I would say it's a 1% response rate to say, yes, here's my primary emissions factor for the timber that you bought from me or the laptops you bought from me. Of course, we know that there isn't that level of sophistication, but it is the data we need. So it's not just, can everyone provide us a primary emissions factor? I'm sure Coles and Woolworths would be loving it if every single potato farmer in Australia could provide per tonne of spuds what the emissions factor is. It's not there. But what's really interesting is the responses you do get. Oh, I'm actually doing scope 1 and 2. Or, yeah, I have done scope 1, 2 and 3, but I've never done an emissions intensity factor. Or, oh, we've never engaged our own supply chain. Or, we're actually not confident in this. That's the kind of data that allows you to then go a little bit deeper into those responses and say, where can we add value? Either working together because this is an obvious barrier, or let's not waste resources on scope 1 and 2. Come on, people, get a spreadsheet out. There's government emissions factors. That's not hard. This is where we should drive our attention. All of those responses, not just can they give us the exact data we want, are very valuable.
Thanks, Jess. And I mentioned at the start that, you know, both you and I have a shared vision that this should be a service that accountants and bookkeepers can provide, that it should become as normal as doing your business activity statement or, you know, doing your annual tax. Is that happening already? Are accountants ready to do this?
Yes, I would say they are. And I don't put this up to be like, oh, logo, but it's more to demonstrate that some of those firms, like Newton Henry, sitting in Launceston in Tassie, probably like a 20-person firm, doing proper GHG accounting, setting the inventory. You could put that in an annual report and tick it off for a local farmers and surf clubs, right? As well as your big players that are doing this, obviously, for the businesses like yourselves or those that we know. And so my point here is to be like, what has changed? Last year, if you said, let's go and ask all of our supply chain, do they have this like audit-ready data that they can provide? It'd be like, who do we go to? Do we have to find a specific consultant? I've got no idea what I'm doing. This is going to cost a fortune. Friction. What has changed as of now is that the majority of accounting firms have upskilled or are upskilling in this space, or they can easily upskill. The resources are there. So even if there is an SMB, and I always say the local baker has a bookkeeper or an accountant helping them stay compliant. So does BHP. They're not paying the same. It's not the exact same service, but we don't say, oh, don't worry about complying with tax legislation because you're an SMB. We have used the existing systems, processes, and professionals to deliver that service as they do through Xero every day of the week. And so this is about making the carbon accounting, and I understand obviously that, you know, ESG is much broader than this, but we swim in the lane and make sure this is done right from our perspective. You know, that is possible for them to now do. And so when you ask that question, it's not, oh, what could they possibly do? It's go and talk to whoever's doing your normal accounting and ask them what's the cost to do their first pass. And we see some SMBs, like I told you about the little B&B, paying a couple of grand to do it properly, and then they're quite proud of that. They're telling all of their customers they're using it in other ways. You have the other end of the scale where, of course, this is hundreds of thousands job, multiple entities. But it can be fit for purpose. I would also say internally, we see a lot the sustainability professionals trying to do the old handball into the finance team, where a lot of this stuff is going. But I don't know if you've read a book called I'm Surrounded by Idiots. Has anyone ever read that? Yes, well, I haven't either, but young Toby, one of our accountants, on the plane yesterday, he has read it, and he said, oh, I've learned a lot about you lately. And I was like, oh, thank you. What exactly have you learned? He's like, oh, you're what we describe as a red, and I'm a blue. And I won't go on to tell you all the feedback, the free feedback that I received after him reading that book yesterday. But what he did say about the blues, and I dare say nearly every person sitting in your finance team or your compliance or risk team is a blue, is that they don't care about our lofty ambitions of saving the world and our beautiful confetti PowerPoint slides that I care about, and you probably care about. They want to know, what do I have to do when I pick up my Excel sheet or when I go to start the reporting? Where is that data coming from? Is it worth the paper it's written on? What system did it come out of? Is it out of Xero? Was it reconciled? Is that what's coming through? Where am I getting the emissions factor? Is that credible? Would I be having a heart attack when the auditors come in, or would I not? These are all the incredibly boring questions those people ask every time they get their hands dirty with this stuff. And I think that's the opportunity, is to go to them early and upskill them.
Thanks, Jess. Well, if you want to hear more about Sumday and Xero, we're both around for the rest of the day. We'd love to have a chat with you. Thanks very much for your time this morning, and I think it's time for morning tea.
Thanks.